Hello and welcome. This is Cheryl. Thank you so much for joining me today. In this video, I'm going to share with you how to use a press plate. A couple months ago, I shared a video on 5 different ways to use a better press plate. And for this video, I'm using those techniques, but tweaking them further. So Spellbinders has sent me a few items here to create with and share with you. I'm using the new Cosmos background Betterpress plate, the You Are Everything Betterpress sentiments, as well as the Cosmos background stencil. Now, I absolutely love using my Betterpress, and I keep finding more and more ways to use this. So the very first card, I'm going to use it in more of a traditional way, but I'll share with you how I like to use the coordinating stencils to add a little bit of extra texture and dimension to my Betterpressed image. So the Betterpress plate or the Betterpress system comes with this little tiny ink pad. I put my plate where I want it to go, and I love the fact that the base is marked with exactly where to line things up for your cards, and the clear plate that comes with it is also lined as well. Once I have inked my plate, I put that clear plate on top of it. I've already taped my cardstock in place, so I know it's not going anywhere. And I usually have my tape around the outside edge because I know I typically trim it down in order to add a mat when I put it on the front of the card. I'm using some Betterpress paper for this one. I'll use other papers for the other techniques that I do, but nothing really has that letterpress look quite as well as the Betterpress paper does. It really has a nice indented look, and you don't actually get the vision, or you don't really see it as well on screen as you do in person. When I like to use the coordinating stencils, I tape my paper down just to make sure that it's not going to shift underneath. And once again, I tape about the same area that I taped it into the Betterpress system. And I also try to pay attention to where the openings of the stencils are and not have my tape where those openings are, because I don't want an area where I'm not going to get my stenciled ink. By taping it around the edges, again, I know I'm going to cut this down, so I'm going to be putting that tape where I'm going to be cutting it down anyways. The first color that I'm using, and I'm using all distress inks for coloring these areas, is Spun Sugar. For these flower petals, there's 2 different stencils that do the flower petals. There's one stencil that does the center of the flowers, and then there's 2 that do the leaves. For this card, I'm using 3 different colors for the flower petals. You don't have to. If you only want to use one color, that's totally fine. I'm using Spun Sugar, Kitsched Flamingo, and then I wanted a little bit of purple in there, so I add a little bit of Wilted Violet to the center. I did the Spun Sugar all over the whole piece of the petal. Then I put the Kitsched Flamingo towards the center, and then I'm using the purple just in that center, and I'm kind of flicking my ink blending brush just from the outside. I want the lines, if you will, of my blending to go with the edges of the petal. I'm also paying attention to where a petal goes under another one, because there would be a natural shadow there, and I'm trying to put a little bit darker ink in those areas as well. For the second stencil, because it's also the flower petals, I'm doing the exact same process. I sped this up for the time of the video. This video would have been probably over an hour long if I didn't speed a bunch of stuff up. So the process is exactly the same. I have those same 3 colors. I did the light color over the whole thing, the Kitsched Flamingo over the center of the flowers, and then just a little bit of Wilted Violet. These stencils are marked right in the bottom left corner which stencil order they're in. You don't necessarily have to go in that order, but it gives you an idea of exactly what order to do them in, and I find it very helpful. It also helps with knowing exactly which way the stencil goes, so you don't have to flip it over to see which way is the right way to go on the image. They're very easy to line up, and you can see that you can see through the stencil, so you can see the image below. For the center of the flowers, I'm doing Hickory Smoke, and then I'm using a detailed ink blending brush with that same ink pad and just doing a darker area around the outside to give a bit of a natural shadow. My other brush was a little bit too big, so I wasn't going to be able to get that shadow on that center without the detail brush. I'm sticking that stencil over to the side because I'm going to use it again in a minute. Now these stencils wash off really easy, especially with this distress ink. It's just a dye-based ink. I just run it under the tap. There's no cleaner needed at all. And I find that it washes off really, really easily. For the leaves, I'm using bundled sage all over, and then I'm going in with some peeled paint, and I'm just doing towards the base of the leaf where the leaf goes underneath something else, like again where there's a natural shadow. I'm making that a little bit darker. I love using two different colors when doing both petals as well as leaves because I like being able to create a little bit of shadow. It just gives it a little bit more life and dimension, and it makes it look a little bit more interesting and a little bit less flat. I'm using the same brush for both the light and the dark green, so I just put it on some scrap paper between the colors just to make sure that I don't have dark green when I want to do light green. That is how it looks after the first stenciling. Now I'm going to go back over and I'm going to put that center of the flower stencil on, and I'm going to add some texture. So I'm using some grit paste Snowfall here. You could use whatever texture paste you want. I liked it because it was a little bit transparent, so it's going to show that gray through it. The one thing to note though is because I had that gray on my stencil, it's going to be lifted up with any excess paste. So I typically try not to have a whole lot of excess paste. I decided to put it back in the container only because I don't think that gray is really going to harm anything else I do in the future, and I'm able to see exactly where it is if I want to avoid it. Typically, I will just toss or not use that excess paste. With that wet paste, I put on some rock candy glitter and then set it aside to dry. For the sentiments, I'm also using the Betterpress paper. I'm doing exactly the same motion that I did for doing the background. This particular plate is a little bit longer than a 4 1/4 by 5 1/2 inch piece of cardstock, and it's also a little bit narrower. So my papers are already pre-cut, so there's a couple sentiments that I'm not going to get on here because of the size of the plate, but I'm okay with that. I get a lot of sentiments from this, and I have way more than I need for this video. I have a lot of extras to use for future projects, but I do pay attention to which sentiments I want, and I just make sure to put the paper or put my plate on my Betterpress so that I can use those stencils. Any of the ones that I don't get complete stencils, I just toss them in the garbage, or I can use, if it's mostly but not all, I can use it for a piece underneath another stencil or another sentiment in order to give a little bit of dimension. I love how precise these sentiments are, and I love the fact that it has a combination of different fonts. I always love sentiments that have a combination of different fonts. In the end, I chose not to use the first sentiments I made, and I did some off screen on some pink cardstock. They just tended to pop off of the card a little bit better, and it highlighted the colors of those flowers. I chose to use a white card base with a purple mat. So my mat is cut at 4 inches by 5 1/4. And then I cut my image piece at 3 7/8 by 5 1/8. So I have just a tiny little border around there. I wanted to have that color there, but I didn't necessarily want a lot of color. So just a thin border there. In order to tie those flowers in with that sentiment, I'm using that same Wilted Violet ink pad, and I'm just inking around the edge of that sentiment. Then I'm going to put my foam tape on the back just to give it a little bit of dimension, just like the texture paste and the glitter. And it's just going to make it pop off a little bit more. I'm using these thin foam strips, but you could also cut multiples of the sentiments with the coordinating die and use that to create some dimension. And I do that in future cards. For this one, I just decided to grab that foam tape. It's hard to figure out exactly where to put the sentiment on this particular card. I ended up putting it in the bottom right corner, but there's so many different areas that you can put it, and I try to put it in a few different places for some of the cards that I'm using. So here's the completed first card, and I love the dimension you get from that texture paste and the glitter. It gives you both dimension as well as the texture and the sparkle from the glitter. For the second card, I'm going to use some distressed watercolor paper, and I am inking the Betterpress plate with that same ink pad that comes with the Betterpress system. This is a permanent ink, so it works well with watercolor. I'm using the distressed watercolor paper because I like the nice bright white that it has as a base, but you could use any watercolor paper with this. It would work. It's worked well with any paper that I've had. Now, because this paper is not as thick as the Betterpress plate paper, you don't get quite as much of an impression. You still get some, but not quite as much. I'm using some magical or Lindy's magical powders in order to watercolor. This one is the Victorian Bouquet set, and I love the fact that you get some natural shimmer with it. What I like to do is use a couple of colors, just like ink blending. I will go over the entire flower with one color, and then I'm adding a second color in order to give it a little bit of dimension. I just like the look of flower petals with a couple different colors. Now this first one, I ended up getting a little bit more of the purple than I really wanted. So you'll notice for the next flowers that I don't put on quite as much. I'll still go in and do the entire flower with the pink color. But before I go in and blend that purple, I just put some on my brush and I dot it, and then I wipe my brush off and blend it out a little bit. It's always easier to add more to it if you want more, a little bit harder to take it away. And once again, I'm working and making sure that any petal that goes underneath another one or a petal that's attached to the base is going to have a natural shadow, so I add a little bit darker color there. The brush that I use is a Zig watercolor brush. It is my favorite watercolor brush. I've had this one for many years, and I even have two of them because one of my daughters wanted to try out watercolor and I was worried about not getting it back. So I bought myself a backup so that I didn't have to worry about her possibly losing it. I did get it back, so I have two of them, and I absolutely love that I can do watercolor with my girls if they want to. I love how versatile these Lindy's magical powders are, and you'll see them used in a couple of the cards in this video, so you'll see a few different ways to use them. They're great for watercoloring like this, and I love the fact that they have a little bit of shimmer to them, and it goes... You get more shimmer where there's a higher concentration of the color. So you'll notice at the end, once the watercolor is dry, that there's more shimmer in the center of the flower or towards the base of the petals than there is at the tip of the petals. And I really like that because if it was an all over shimmer, even throughout the whole thing, it would look a little bit odd and a little bit less interesting in my opinion. So you'll see once it's completely dried that there is more shimmer towards the center, and I really like that. They also come in a ton of different sets. This one happens to be my favorite set, and I tend to reach for it often. I love how it looks on both light cardstock as well as dark cardstock. Now this watercolor brush has water in the handle, so as you see me going to the paper towel, I'm just blotting excess color off. Sometimes I'm squeezing the brush to clean the color out of the tip of the brush, and it makes it really easy to use. I tend to be a little bit of a klutz, so it's nice to not have a water jar or water dish on my work surface that I could possibly spill, because chances are I would spill it. This is the green that comes in the set. It's a little bit bright for greenery, but in a little bit, I'll show you how I make it a little bit more natural looking and dull it down a little bit. I didn't want to introduce any more of the Lindy's sets, so I wanted to use just the colors that were in one set, but there is an easy way to change the color tone a little bit, and I'll share that with you once I'm done using this base color. Same as when I'm doing my stenciling, I start where the color is the darkest, and I put the darkest color at the base of the leaf as well as where the leaf would go behind a petal or behind the flower, or on the top left hand there's a leaf that kind of has a curve to it, so you see the flip side of it, and I'll put a shadow in there as well. Anytime I'm watercoloring, I start where I want the color darkest, and then I blend out where I want to lighten the color. And you'll see that my hand position doesn't really change a whole lot, but I do shift and turn the paper around as I'm working. I pulled the blue out thinking that I might want to use it, and then I ended up deciding not to. The orange is also one of the colors in this set, and I put it in the center of the flowers. It has a more coppery look to it, and once it's dry, it'll look a little bit more on the copper side rather than on the orange side. I'm personally not a huge fan of orange, so I do prefer the flowers with the gray center rather than the coppery orange center, but it's not too bad. I actually never looked to see what the natural color of Cosmos were because I thought it'd be fun to just play. So I'm taking my palette here. I've got some distress re-inkers in here. These are the re-inkers meant to refill or re-ink your ink pads, and I'm using that to color the small little leaves in here. I'm using the bundled sage, and then I'll go back in with the peeled paint. And I'm going to do the same thing with those Lindy's colored large leaves. I'm just changing the color tone a little bit. I liked it better with the bundled sage, and then I went back in and did the peeled paint, and I liked it even more. It was just enough to take that Kelly green, kind of that really bright, not natural looking green, and kind of tone it down a little bit. And in my opinion, it made the flowers kind of look a little bit more natural. When it was the first shade of green, I found that you kind of, or my eye kind of leaned towards the leaves. And once I changed the color tone of them, I could see the flowers a little bit more, which is the main reason why I wanted to change the color tone of it. But it's a really easy way to do it. These Distress Reinkers are transparent, so you see that other shade underneath them, and I think it just creates a better shade of green. Here it is once it's completely dry, and you can see that there's a lot more shimmer in the center of those flowers and on the base of the leaves where the color is a little bit more dark. I chose a dark purple base to this, and I'm using those same sentiments that were done on the pink cardstock. I'm doing the same technique where I ink blend around the edges to get some purple there. It kind of just tones down the pink, and it just ties it in a little bit more with the colors of the flowers. This one was glued down flat without any pop dot or foam tape popping it up, and I glued it in the center of the card. My third card, I wanted to use my glimmer machine and do some foiling, but I wanted to make sure that any ink residue left on that plate wasn't going to affect anything. So I'm just using Ranger archival ink cleaner here just to clean off any ink from the plate. I didn't think it was really going to affect it, but better to be safe than sorry and have that plate nice and clean. And I also wanted to take a moment to show you how easy it is to clean these plates off. Because this ink is permanent, it doesn't all transfer to the paper, so some of it stays on that plate. It's really easy to take it off. And I just have a microfiber cloth here that I keep in my craft room, perfect for cleaning things off, as well as quickly wiping down my working surface and making sure that I've got a clean area to work on. So for my third card, I want to use my glimmer machine. I'm using some prism foil and some Hammermill cardstock. Already, I can't remember if I mentioned at the beginning of the video. So the 5 cards that I showed are from a previous video, and these are similar techniques as those, but I've tweaked them. So I'm using either different cardstock or a different technique with them, just to give you a little bit more ideas. So if you've never used a glimmer machine before, I wait for my platform to completely heat up. I put my plate on there, the foil with the pretty side facing the plate, and then my Hammermill cardstock on top, as well as the plates. Press the timer button. Once the timer button is done, it goes through my Platinum 6 machine. You want to use the glimmer machine for the heat and the Platinum or the die cutting machine for the pressure. These Betterpress plates foil absolutely beautiful. You can foil Betterpress plates, but you cannot use the Betterpress with the foil plates. So something to know, it works one way, it does not work the other way. While I'm out here foiling, I'm going to foil the negative part as well, and I reuse these regularly. Sometimes I use them for mats around the card, and that's what I'm going to use for one of these pieces today. The sentiment piece, I'm going to die cut it, and I like to use both the foiled image as well as the reverse foiled image for the sentiments. Sometimes the reverse foiled is just what works for the front of a card, and it's nice to be able to use as much of this foil as possible. And so I always do both the positive and the negative foiling while I have the machine out and while I have it hot. It is the best way to get the most out of your foil. I love foiling with these Betterpress plates because you get such a really nice fine detail and such just some beautiful detail to it. So I'm using this Cloud 9 interference ink pad. I have my paper here that is foiled. I'm going to tape it down. And this interference ink pad, it looks different on white cardstock than it does on black cardstock. So we're going to play around with that, with the flower image. I'm not doing the leaves with these interference pads. I think that would be a little bit too much, but I thought it would be a great way to highlight the flowers. So in order to take advantage of it showing up differently on 2 different colors, I'm taking a black distress pad and I'm using a detailed blending brush, and I'm just going from the center of the flower, flicking it out. I want the strokes from this ink to look or to follow the lines of the petal. I don't want a round ink blended look. I want to make sure that it just looks a little bit more natural. I'm doing that with all of the flower petals, and I'm going to do that for both the first and the second layer, using that black color and ink blending out. And then I'm using my cloth and I'm just cleaning on any of that excess ink off of my stencil. I don't want to mix it in with my ink blending brush with this pad. I want to make sure that it's cleaned off. I have the ink blending brush here that I haven't used for anything else, and I'm using it for this color, and after I've used it for this color, I'll label it and make sure to only use it with these interference pads. You don't want to go and use this with your distress pads because they have some pigment in there, and if you happen to get some pigment ink on your distress pads, you can ruin them, and we don't want to do that. So for the second layer, I'm going to do the same process as the first layer. I'm using that detailed brush with my black pad, flicking out, and once again, same as the first two cards, anywhere there's a petal that goes underneath another, I do pay attention to that and put a little bit of black there as a shadow. And I also make the black go from the center of the flower out or the base of the petal out. The petal or the flower on the top left there, the bottom petals are kind of coming out from the bottom, so I make sure to have some shadow on the bottom of that rather than the center of that, what looks like the center of the flower, if that makes any sense. After I have the ink down there, I am using that same cloth and cleaning off the excess ink off of my stencil. And then I'm going to do the same process, covering the entire petal or the entire flower with that ink. And this ink washes off beautifully as well from the stencils. You don't have to worry about having to wash them off right away. And look at that shimmer. It's hard to see it when the ink is still wet, but once it's dry, you can see the difference in the colors a lot better. For the center, or for the center of the petals of the flowers, I'm using another one of those interference pads. So the first one I used is called Opal Blush. The center of the flowers here, I'm using one called Peacock Tails, and it has the same properties. It looks different on light than it does on dark. So I use that detailed brush to go on the center, or sorry, on the outside to put a little bit of a shadow. And then I cleaned my stencil off, went in with the ink blending brush and covered the whole center of that flower. For the leaves, I'm using that same bundled sage and peeled paint that I used for the first card, and I'm ink blending exactly the same way. I'm starting with the bundled sage, going in with the peeled paint where there would be some shadow, clean my brush off between the two colors. When I go to the fifth stencil, I start again with that bundled sage and then go back in with the peeled paint to put the color in where it would be darker. So the base of the leaves are going to be darker, and underneath petals where there would be a natural shadow is going to be darker. And I like the contrast there is between the colors of the flowers and the leaves. The leaves are a little bit flatter. Those flowers have a beautiful iridescent there. I'm actually explaining it to my daughter. She came in to check out what I was doing there. And I love the interference colors with those petals as well as the interference colors with the foil. It looks absolutely stunning in person together. So those stencils there, that's after I just rinsed them off with water. Didn't even need to use any cleaner or anything. They just wash right off. So for my layers, I'm going to cut my solid hot foiled piece at 4 1/8 inches by 5 3/8 inches. And then my image piece is 4 inches by 5 1/4. So I have an 1/8 of an inch difference between the layers. This is just going to create smaller areas for the mat, but it just is a little bit more interesting sometimes to vary up the layers a little bit. And for some reason right now, I like the smaller layers. So I'm using Barely Art glue to glue all my layers together, and I'm putting an acrylic block on top of my pieces while they're drying, just so that I have my hands free in order to do other things. I have my sentiment here that is foiled and die cut, and then I'm using that detailed blending brush with the black, and I'm going to go over this whole piece with one of those interference ink, and I use the Opal Blush for this one just to have it coordinate with those flowers. It really made it pop off the page a lot more. Because these sentiments cut out so many, if by chance one thing doesn't work out, there's always another sentiment to use. And by using just the white one, I found that it didn't really, it kind of blended in the page. And I thought to use the negative one and it just didn't pop either. So this was the perfect solution. Coordinates beautifully with those flowers. I also did some die cutting of some scrap papers in order to put those on the back so that it could pop off the page a little bit more. Just a great way to use up some of those cardstock scraps and give them another life rather than just tossing them out. So my Barely Art glue here, I have it in a fine tip bottle. It's really easy to get nice and detailed glue where you want it and not having to worry about excess peeling off. Off screen, I use my label maker just to make labels for these brushes so that I know exactly what ink is on them. And I do keep them with those ink pads so that I know what brushes I have ink pads for. So these are all the sentiments I have left here, perfect for future projects. I know they're going to get used and I love having excess sentiments to quickly grab. For my fourth technique, in the first video, I used a Vaseline or created a Vaseline resist and did it with an alcohol ink background. For this one, we're going to do it with a watercolor background. So I have some Vaseline that I put into a tin here, and I have a makeup sponge that has a flat edge to it. I'm picking up some Vaseline on there and just lightly dabbing it onto the raised surface. I can see that I'm getting a little bit on the background, but it doesn't really touch the paper, so it doesn't affect the pressing. I went over it twice just to make sure that I had good coverage, and I'm working on watercolor paper here because I want to do a technique with some water, and I want to make sure that I have some cardstock that can handle that water. Now, before I put my Betterpress plate to the side and forget that I have Vaseline on here, I used a baby wipe just to wipe everything off, and then I'm using the same Ranger archival cleaner that I used before to clean my plate off. I want to make sure that I don't have anything on there that could possibly resist any ink that I put on there in the future, and by doing this, it worked perfectly. Everything is nice and clean. I also make sure to clean off the back of that plate. Sometimes some of the cleaner can seep under the back of it, and I want to make sure that everything is completely cleaned off. So I'm going to use those same Lindy's Magicals powders again for this technique. And yes, we are again using watercolor paper, but we're going to use them in a completely different way. So I have a distress sprayer here. I sprayed my surface with water, put my watercolor paper on top of that, and then sprayed the top of this as well. This is a technique that I like to use in order to keep that paper staying flat. If I don't put that water underneath there, that water kind of suctions it in place, and that way both sides of my paper are wet and my paper tends to not curl. If you only put water on the front of it, it tends to curl and then you get the color running off the side. While that is wet, I'm using a fan brush to dip in the different colors, and I'm sprinkling it on top of the different areas of my image. Now, this is a very loose and flowy technique. You're not going to get precision here. The only way to get precision here would be to do the technique that I used on the second card, where I used a watercolor brush and watercolored it. I'm deliberately working with this in this way because I want a loose look. I love the way it looks at the end, and I wanted to see the resist that Vaseline created on that watercolor paper, and it worked exactly as I hoped it was going to work. You still get a beautiful watercolored image, but it's very loose and flowy. It reminds me of that, I think it's Monet painting with the leaves and the lily pads, the water. I think it's the colors as well as the way it ended up drying. So this is the finished result. You got a little bit of shimmer in there with the water. You see the lines of the image from the Vaseline resist. That paper was 4 inches or 4 1/4 by 5 1/2 when I started. I cut it down to 4 inches by 5 1/4, and I just glued it onto a white card base. I like the look of the crisp white behind there. And then I just put one of my simple foiled sentiments on there. The silver foil was perfect with this. I did die cut some extra pieces of scrap cardstock to go on the back to give it a little bit of extra dimension. I really liked the look of this background. I didn't want to add a whole lot to it. I wanted to keep it nice and simple. So the sentiment I chose was just a happy anniversary. You could use it for whatever sentiment you want. I think it would work really, really pretty, but that foil looks really nice with the shimmer from those Lindy's Magicals. For my last technique, we're going to do some embossing. So I'm using some black mixed media heavy stock here, and I'm using some Versamark ink on my Betterpress pad. I have an embossing powder tool. I want to make sure that that embossing powder only sticks to my Versamark ink. And by putting that powder tool on there, I can make sure to get as precise as possible with that embossing. And I'm going to emboss both the sentiment Betterpress plate as well as my floral background. I'm using silver embossing powder here. Any color would work. Well, really, any color that shows up on black will work. Clear powder would technically work, but you won't really see the sentiment quite as much. I'm using my embossing tool in order to melt that powder. That powder is sticking just to that Versamark ink, so you do need to use an embossing tool to melt it. And you can see exactly where it is embossed because it goes from a matte granular to a nice shiny background. I went and swapped my plates out here, and I have my floral background using that same Versamark ink pad, and I'm very careful to only try to ink the raised surface of that. I'm not pressing down really hard. It's very light. And then I put it through my Platinum 6 machine for that pressure to press that image in. And you can see how beautiful of an image it creates on that black cardstock. Now, you could even leave this image exactly as it is and not do anything to it, but we're going to enhance it even more. While I have my tools out, I'm taking my die cut for the sentiments, and I'm die cutting those sentiments. I also die cut a few extra pieces in order to put behind there to add a little bit of extra dimension. So I love the fact that I get so many different sentiments here. I can save them for future projects, and that silver embossing looks really, really pretty on that black. So I'm going to go back and use my stencils once again. I'm taping my cardstock down here, and then I'm going to tape that stencil down. And we're also going to be using those Lindy's Magical Powders again. So this is another way that you can use them. Now I'm using a Versamark ink pad here, and I'm pressing that ink into those areas of the stencil. You'll notice that my tape doesn't stick super well. The tape is meant to help, but because the Versamark ink is so sticky, it's not going to hold the stencil down without you helping it. It is grabbing onto that stencil and wanting to lift it up. But I do want to use Versamark ink here as just a different way to use that stencil. So in those open areas, I'm using the purple and the blue in this kit. I'm putting the purple in the center of the flower, the blue on the outside petals of the flower. And it's really easy to see exactly where that Versamark ink is because it makes that cardstock shiny. Now, before I go to my next stencil, I want to take any of that excess powder off. And I just have a Swiffer duster cloth to go over that background, and it takes it off really easily. You could do this same technique with Perfect Pearls or any mica powder that is activated by water. We're going to mist this with water later, and it's amazing how these colors come alive when you do that. For the second layer of petals, I'm doing it exactly the same as the first. The blue goes in the center, the purple goes around the outside. Now, you'll notice when I put my colors or my mica powders, the Lindy's Magicals, I put the lid beside the tin or beside the jar with the colored side up so I know exactly which color is what. And when I put that purple onto my black cardstock, it actually looked blue, which is one of the reasons why I do that. I want to remember exactly which color is which, and that's the easiest way to do it. Every single time between different stencils, I do go with that Swiffer duster cloth and remove any excess powder. It's hard to get the exact amount of powder on here. You always end up with a little bit of excess. So by having that cloth, cleaning everything off in between time, you can make sure that that next layer of Versamark gets to where it needs to be and you're not picking up just powder with it. For the leaves, I'm using a combination of a little bit of the blue with the green from this set. I wanted the blue to go where any of the shadows would be. And it just adds a little bit of extra color to it. It just changes the color tone of that green slightly, and it blends a little bit when I go and mist it in a minute. So once I have that blue in the base of the leaves, I go over the entire thing with the green, and then I'm going to take my duster cloth, take off any of the excess, and here's where the magic happens. You can see as soon as I mist it with some water, those colors seem to come alive. Now I didn't mist my surface before time, and I realized that after I misted it. In order to avoid the color or the paper warping, I did go in and mist it and then kind of pressed my paper in there to make sure that that paper wouldn't curl. I also off screen took one of those Lindy's Magicals and did one of my sentiments with it just to tie that in. It didn't pop off the page as well when it was just black. I used exactly the same process as I did with the stencil. I just didn't have a stencil. I just did it on my work surface and then let those two dry together. With the extra sentiments I cut from scrap cardstock, I'm just using my Barely Art glue and gluing them together, stacking them on top of each other. And once that glue has had a moment to hold, I will glue it to the center of the card. This glue, even though it's a liquid glue, it starts to grab and hold that paper fairly quickly, so you don't need to wait too long. And here it is once it's completely dry. I love that shimmer on that black background. Here are all 5 of the cards. This one is the Vaseline Resist with those magical powders. This is the foiled one with the Cloud9 Interference ink pads. Here is our watercolor background with those Lindy's Magical powders, and here's our original Betterpress with the texture paste in the center of the flowers and the rock candy glitter. If you have a favorite technique, put it in the comments. I'd love to hear what your favorites are. Love using this Betterpress and finding more and more ways to use it. I hope you enjoyed this video, and thank you so much for spending your time here watching.